When we think of Roman slavery, this is the image that's seared into our minds. It's a vision of absolute, unchecked power, where a master's whim is law and his anger a potential death sentence. And for a lot of Roman history, that grim picture wasn't far from the truth. Under Roman law, slaves were basically seen as res, things, property. They were often called by the chillingly detached name speaking tools. They could be bought and sold, beaten, and abused with almost no legal way to fight back. The master was the master, and his power seemed limitless. But what if that's not the whole story? What if, woven into the fabric of this brutal system, there were threads of restraint? What if I told you that as the Roman world grew and changed, a complex and surprising web of laws, social rules, and cold, hard economics started to place very real limits on what a master could get away with? Now, this isn't a story that erases the horrors of slavery. It was a monstrous system, but it does reveal a more complicated truth. The idea of a master's absolute power is, in many ways, a myth. Over the centuries, some surprising rules emerged, creating cracks in that wall of total domination. Today, we're exploring the forgotten laws and social pressures that held Roman masters in check. We'll uncover what they were forbidden from doing, the lines that, legally at least, they weren't supposed to cross. And in doing so, we'll discover a side of ancient Rome that is far more complex, contradictory, and fascinating than the simple story of absolute power allows. In the early days of the Roman Republic, the head of the household, the paterfamilias, had a power that was terrifyingly absolute. It was known as ius vitae nociske, the right of life and death, over everyone in his home. This didn't just apply to slaves. In theory, it even extended to his own children. A slave was an object, a piece of property like a cart or a clay pot, and destroying your own property was your business, not the state's. If a master killed his slave, it was his own financial loss, but it wasn't a crime. For centuries, that was the grim reality. But as Rome swelled from a city-state into a massive empire, things began to shift. New ideas, like Stoic philosophy, which talked about a universal brotherhood of man, started to filter into Roman thought. More importantly, the emperors began to gather more power for themselves, slowly chipping away at the authority of individual patriarchs. They wanted to maintain public order and, to some extent, public decency. The idea that a man could kill another human being, even one he owned, without any consequences started to feel less like a private right and more like a threat to a stable society. The first major legal blow against this absolute power came in the 2nd century AD under Emperor Antoninus Pius. He issued a landmark ruling that completely changed the legal landscape. Under this new law, a master who killed his own slave without just cause could be prosecuted for homicide. He would face the same penalty as if he had killed someone else's slave. Think about that for a second. This was revolutionary. It was the first time the law officially stepped between a master and his slave with the threat of a murder charge. Now, that phrase, "without just cause," is doing a lot of work here. The law didn't forbid a master from killing a slave as punishment, but it meant he couldn't just kill a slave in a fit of rage over something trivial. There had to be a reason, a causa, that a court would find acceptable. This was, of course, a huge loophole, and enforcement was probably all over the place. But the principle was set. A master's power wasn't totally arbitrary anymore. He was now, in theory, accountable to the law for the life of his slave. This legal shift continued and was made even clearer in the early 4th century AD under Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor. Constantine's law equated the intentional killing of a slave with the murder of a free person. The law got pretty specific about what counted as intentional murder, using a dagger, poison, hanging, or throwing them from a great height. However, this law came with a massive and horrifying catch. If a slave died from normal punishment, for example, being beaten to death with whips or rods, the master was considered blameless. The law drew a line between premeditated murder and a death that happened during discipline, no matter how brutal. So, while these laws were a huge step forward from the early republic, let's not get carried away. They didn't end the violence of slavery. A master could still, quite legally, beat a slave to death and face no penalty. But what he could no longer do was execute a slave on a whim, without reason, or through methods seen as especially cruel, without risking the anger of the Roman state. The ius vitae nociske was effectively gone, replaced by a system where the state, not the individual, held the ultimate power of life and death. It was a change driven as much by the desire to centralize power as by any sense of humanity. But for the first time, a slave was recognized, however faintly, as more than just a thing. They were a person whose life couldn't be snuffed out without some kind of legal reason. Imagine a slave named Lyra. Her owner, Marcus, is a merchant with a violent temper, and for years, she's endured his cruelty. But one day, after a vicious beating over a spilled jug of wine, she knows she won't survive another. She runs, not to the countryside, where she'd be hunted down, but right into the heart of the city, to the Roman Forum. She fights through the crowds until she sees it, a gleaming marble statue of the emperor. She lunges for its base, clinging to it as if her life depends on it, because it does. This act, seeking refuge at an emperor's statue or in a temple, was one of the most dramatic and surprising protections a slave had in the Roman Empire. It was called the right of asylum, and it could completely change a slave's fate. This wasn't a run for freedom. Lyra wouldn't be freed for this. Instead, what she was doing was making a formal, public complaint of intolerable cruelty. By seeking sanctuary, she was kicking off a legal process. An official, like the city prefect, was now required to investigate her claims. Her master, Marcus, would be summoned. He couldn't just drag her away from the statue. That would be an act of sacrilege against the emperor's image. He would have to answer to the official. Witnesses might be called. Lyra's own injuries would be powerful, silent proof. If the magistrate decided that Marcus's cruelty was truly intolerable, the consequences for him were serious. He would be legally forced to sell Lyra. This forced sale was a pretty clever solution from the Roman point of view. It punished the abusive master in two ways, financially and in his reputation. Marcus would lose his property, and the whole public affair would bring him shame. Over-the-top cruelty was bad for an owner's reputation. At the same time, the system kept the institution of slavery intact. Lyra wasn't freed. She was just sold to a new owner, hopefully a better one. The state stepped in, not to end slavery, but to control its worst abuses and prevent the kind of desperation that might lead to revolts or public chaos. This protection was officially recognized under emperors like Antoninus Pius, who explicitly stated that if a master's cruelty was proven unbearable, he had to sell the slave. This gave slaves a voice, even if it was a faint and risky one. The run to that statue was dangerous. If caught, the punishment would be terrible, and there was no guarantee the magistrate would believe them. But the fact that this path existed at all is extraordinary. It shows that Roman society knew there was a limit to how much suffering a person could be expected to take, even a slave. It was a system that treated the slave as property, but also acknowledged their humanity enough to grant them a way to appeal for protection from the worst kinds of abuse. For a slave like Lyra, clinging to that cold marble statue, it was the only hope she had. The roar of the crowd in the Colosseum, the sun glinting off a gladiator's helmet, and the terrifying spectacle of damnatio ad bestias, being condemned to the beasts. We all have these images in our heads of cruel Roman masters, on a whim, sending a disobedient slave into the arena to be torn apart by lions for entertainment. It was, without a doubt, one of the most horrifying ways to die in the ancient world. But could a master really do that just because he felt like it? The surprising answer is no. As early as 61 AD, a key law called the Lex Petronia was passed. It put a strict legal barrier between a master's rage and the jaws of the arena's beasts. This law flat out prohibited a master from sending his slave to be killed by animals without getting a judge's approval first. If a master wanted to use this punishment, he had to go to court and prove the slave had committed a crime so terrible that it deserved such a gruesome death. The decision was taken out of the master's hands and given to the state. This law was a big deal. Now, it wasn't really about the slave's well-being. Roman legal experts were clear that these laws were mostly about keeping public order and making sure the state had the final say. But the effect was huge. It meant the arena couldn't be used as a master's private punishment tool. The irreversible and spectacular punishment of being thrown to the beasts was a power saved for the state, to be used only after a formal legal process. There was also a powerful economic reason for this. A slave, especially a skilled one, was a valuable asset. A good cook, an educated tutor, a strong farmhand, They all represented a big investment. Sending a slave like that to the arena was literally throwing money away. It just didn't make sense financially. Why destroy a valuable asset when a beating or branding could fix the behavior while keeping the slave alive and working? The philosopher Seneca wrote about treating slaves with some reason, not just out of kindness, but because it was practical. The Lex Petronia fit this logic perfectly. It stopped masters from making rash, financially stupid decisions in a fit of anger. Of course, this doesn't mean slaves never died in the arena. Plenty did, but it's important to understand how they ended up there. Many were already criminals in the eyes of the state who happened to be slaves. Others were prisoners of war, and some slaves were sold by their owners directly to a lanista, the owner of a gladiator school. In that case, the sale itself sealed their fate. But the Lex Petronia specifically stopped a master who owned, say, a household servant, from deciding on his own to use the arena as a form of execution. That he couldn't do without a judge's permission. The law was a check, not on the arena's brutality, but on the random power of the individual master to command it. In the middle of the Tiber River in Rome, there's a small, boat-shaped island. In ancient times, it was home to the temple of Aesculapius, the god of medicine. People went there for centuries seeking miraculous cures. But by the time of Emperor Claudius in the 1st century AD, it had earned a much darker reputation. It had become a dumping ground. Masters with slaves who were sick, old, or just worn out from a lifetime of work faced a tough choice. Medical care was expensive, and feeding a slave who couldn't work anymore was a waste of money. So, some chose a cruel and easy way out. They'd take their sick slaves to the island of Aesculapius and just abandon them to die. They could then claim the slave ran away or died from their illness, avoiding any more cost. And if, by some miracle, the slave got better, the master could just go back and reclaim his property. Emperor Claudius, however, was not having it. He found the practice intolerable and, in a famous and hugely important edict, he put a stop to it. The law he passed did two critical things. First, any slave abandoned by their master on the island who then recovered would be granted their freedom. They would not go back to the master who left them for dead. Second, and even more powerfully, the edict said that if a master chose to kill his sick slave rather than go to the trouble of abandoning him, he would be charged with murder. This edict of Claudius is such a fascinating law because of how it attacks the problem. On the one hand, it's clearly humane. It offered freedom to the most vulnerable and punished the ultimate act of cruelty, killing a helpless person just to save a few coins. It was a direct response to a practice that was obviously seen as wrong. On the other hand, it was also deeply practical. Abandoned, dying people are a public health risk, and the edict reinforced a basic principle of responsible ownership. A slave was property, and a good Roman was expected to maintain his property, not just throw it away. By abandoning a slave, a master was basically giving up his ownership and responsibilities. The law just made that official. If the slave recovered, they were no longer his. The law perfectly captures the strange double life of a slave in the Roman mind. The slave was property, an investment to be maintained. But the slave was also a person who could be wronged, who could suffer, and who, in specific cases like this one, could be given the ultimate prize, freedom. Claudius's law didn't stop masters from owning people, but it did tell them they couldn't just treat them like trash when they became inconvenient. The act of abandonment now came with a real consequence: losing your property for good. In the Roman world, a master owned a slave's body, plain and simple. This power was often used in brutal ways, from branding with hot irons to floggings that left scars for life. But even here, in this most physical form of control, the Roman state eventually drew a line. One of the most specific and telling rules was about the act of castration. During the empire, eunuchs were a highly valued and very expensive type of slave. Castrated men were wanted for all sorts of jobs in rich households. They were seen as safe guardians for the women of the house. Since they couldn't have children, they posed no threat to the family bloodline. They were also prized as high-level servants and administrators, their unique status setting them apart. This demand created a profitable, if horrifying, market. Some masters, seeing a chance for a huge payday, would have their own male slaves castrated just to jack up their price. This practice, however, came to be seen as an insult, not just to the slave, but to Roman dignity. The act of castration was viewed as an unnatural mutilation of the human body. The emperors, as the self-appointed guardians of Roman morals, started to step in. The first big move against it came from Emperor Domitian in the late 1st century AD. He banned castration within the Roman Empire. His successor, Emperor Hadrian, went even further, making the penalties much harsher. Under Hadrian's law, anyone who performed a castration on a free man or a slave, with or without consent, could be prosecuted under the Lex Cornelia, a tough law meant for assassins and poisoners. The doctor who did it, and the master who ordered it, were now guilty of a major crime. The reasons behind these laws were complicated. It was partly about a growing sense of what was acceptable to do to a human body, even a slave's. Philosophers at the time often condemned extreme practices like this. But it was also about state control. The emperors were stepping in to regulate a morally shady and very profitable business. They were asserting the state's right to decide what could and could not be done to a body, even a body legally defined as property. This rule is so revealing because it wasn't about stopping a punishment. Castration was usually a cold, calculated business move to make an asset more valuable. By banning it, the state was saying there were limits to a master's right to alter a slave's body for profit. The slave's physical integrity, at least in this one very specific way, was now protected by law. A master could brand his slave, beat him, and work him to exhaustion, but he could no longer mutilate him in this permanent and profound way just to make a buck. The sexual exploitation of slaves was a dark and constant reality in the Roman world. Because slaves were property, a master had nearly total sexual access to them. For the most part, the law was silent on this. Forcing a female slave into prostitution was also a common way for an owner to make money from his property. It showed the almost complete lack of bodily autonomy for the enslaved. But even here, there was one surprising legal loophole that could, in some cases, offer protection: a contract clause known as "ini serva prostituatur." This Latin phrase translates to that the female slave not be prostituted. It wasn't a universal law, but a special condition that could be written into the bill of sale when a slave was sold from one master to another. If this clause was in the contract, it became a legally binding rule for the new owner and anyone who bought her after that. If any owner broke this rule and forced the woman into prostitution, the consequence was immediate and automatic. She became free. This was an incredibly powerful tool. It didn't depend on the master's goodwill. It was a matter of contract law. If the clause was broken, the slave became a free woman. So, who would add a clause like this and why? The reasons could be varied and deeply personal. Imagine a poor father forced to make the heartbreaking choice to sell his own daughter into slavery. He might insist on the "ini serva prostituatur" clause as one last, desperate act of protection, making sure that while his daughter would be a slave, she would be spared the particular horror of the brothel. Or maybe a female owner, a domina, selling a trusted handmaiden she grew up with. She might add the clause out of affection or a sense of duty, trying to protect the girl's honor. It could even be a way for a seller to protect their own reputation, to show they weren't someone who profited from such a dishonorable business. This legal tool is fascinating because it worked entirely within the logic of property and contract law. It didn't challenge slavery itself, but it used the system's own rules to create a small pocket of protection. Of course, this protection was conditional. It depended entirely on a previous owner having the foresight and motive to include it. Most slaves, captured in war or bought from big-time traders, would never have such a clause. And yet, its existence is remarkable. It shows that Roman law could, and did, recognize the idea of a slave's sexual honor as something that could be legally protected by a contract. A master could buy a slave, but he couldn't always buy the right to do absolutely anything he wanted with her. If that right was specifically withheld, he was bound by law, and the penalty for breaking that bond was the total loss of his property. In the eyes of Roman law, a slave couldn't really have a family. Lacking legal personhood, they couldn't get married in a way the law recognized, which was called connubium. A male slave wasn't a legal father and had no legal power, asterisk potestas asterisk, over his children. His partner and kids were, just like him, the property of his master. This meant a master had the legal right to break up families whenever he wanted, selling a husband away from his wife, or a mother from her child. It was one of the cruelest parts of Roman slavery. And yet, Even though the law didn't recognize them, family bonds among slaves were common and often accepted, especially on large estates. These unofficial unions between slaves were known as contubernium. While not a legal marriage, a contubernium was often a stable, long-term partnership where children were born and raised. Many masters didn't just allow these unions. They actively encouraged them for very practical reasons. Slaves born and raised in the household, known as vurni, were often seen as more loyal and reliable, and less likely to run away than slaves bought from some faraway market. They knew no other life. Creating a stable family environment could lead to a happier, more productive workforce and lower the risk of rebellion. A master might even record these family units in the household's books, showing a practical, if not legal, recognition of these ties. Over time, this social reality started to creep into the law. While a master's right to separate families was never officially taken away, Roman legal thinkers and eventually imperial laws started to show a clear preference for keeping slave families together. In legal texts like the Digest, a massive collection of Roman legal writings, we see jurists arguing that when an estate was being divided or sold, slave families shouldn't be split up if it could be avoided. A law was even passed that discouraged separating husbands and wives, parents and children, or siblings in these situations. But we should be careful here. This was more of a legal guideline or a moral suggestion than a solid, enforceable right for the slave. A master's financial needs could still easily trump this preference. If a master was in debt, he could and would sell family members separately to get a better price. There was no way for a slave to sue his master for selling his child. Still, the change is significant. It shows a growing legal and social awkwardness with the casual destruction of families. The state was once again nudging its way in, suggesting a best practice that valued family unity, probably because it helped keep society stable. The law began to see the contubernium not as a marriage, but as a social reality worth keeping. A master still had the power to shatter a slave family, but by the late empire, doing so was increasingly seen as a cruel act that went against the spirit, if not always the letter, of the law. These laws and social rules paint a picture of Rome that's so much more detailed and contradictory than we usually think. It's a world where the line between person and property could get blurry, and where absolute power was, surprisingly, not always absolute. Digging into these hidden layers of the past is what this channel is all about. If you find this journey into the complexities of history as fascinating as I do, please consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell. We explore the myths and realities of ancient civilizations every week, and your support helps us bring these stories to light. Let me know in the comments, which one of these restrictions surprised you the most? So, what couldn't a master do to a slave in ancient Rome? As we've seen, the list is longer and more surprising than you might think. Despite being legally classified as property, by the height of the empire, a master could not kill a slave without a legally valid reason. He couldn't just toss a slave to the beasts in the arena. He needed a judge's verdict first. He couldn't abandon his sick and elderly slaves to die without losing them for good if they recovered. He couldn't castrate a male slave for profit. And under certain contracts he was legally bound to honor. He couldn't force a female slave into prostitution. He was even discouraged, both socially and sometimes by law, from ripping apart the slave families that formed in his own home. Now, we have to be real about what these limits meant. None of these laws came close to erasing the fundamental, soul-crushing brutality of slavery. It was still a system built on forced labor, dehumanization, and violence. Enforcement of these protections was spotty at best, and the rights they offered were tiny and could vanish in an instant. And yet, the fact that they existed at all tells a profound story. They reveal the complex push and pull within Roman society, a society struggling with its own contradictions. These laws show the growing influence of philosophy, the practical need to protect valuable assets, and above all, the slow but steady expansion of the state's power into every corner of life, including the private relationship between a master and his slave. The story of slavery in Rome isn't just about what masters could do. The story of what they were forbidden from doing is just as revealing, giving us a glimpse into the legal and moral evolution of one of history's greatest and most complex civilizations.